Welcome to Ministries That Podcast, where I talk to successful ministry leaders about how they're using podcasting to amplify their mission and grow their ministry so you can too. I'm Tim Hull, your host and owner of Sonomorphic, a podcast production company that specializes in podcasting for ministries. My guest today is Jordan Raynor. He's a best-selling author, keynote speaker, and host of Mere Christians, a podcast where he has conversations about how the gospel influences the work of those of us who aren't pastors or religious professionals. Jordan and I are going to talk about how to get big-name guests on your podcast, the connection between podcasting and being an author and speaker, and his time management method for producing a weekly podcast. So let's dive in. Here's my conversation with Jordan Raynor. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast today.
Yeah, Tim, it's great to be here.
Yeah, so I first came across your work back when I was the producer of the EntreLeadership podcast at Ramsey Solutions. One of your books came across my desk. And then more recently, I found out you were connected with Luke Lefevre, who I worked with at Ramsey. I found out that he was on your podcast, and he recently on one of the calls that we were doing as we're working on starting his podcast, we were talking about how you impacted his story. So that was a really cool conversation to hear. And so as I was digging and preparing for this episode, I found out that you also have a very interesting story into getting into podcasting. And so I'm really excited to have you on the show today. So let's start with that story. I listened back to episode 100 where you were interviewed on your own podcast, Mere Christians, and it actually went by a different name at that time, and we'll get into that a little bit later. But you shared your journey of being an entrepreneur and CEO, and then you left your role as CEO a few years later and then started your own business. So tell me the story of why you decided to step down as a CEO in March of 2019 and start content creating full time.
Tim, I told you before we started recording, this is super fun for me because authors never get to talk about craft. All they ever talk about is content, right? So this is super fun. Quick context for our listeners. I spent the first 10 years of my career as a tech startup CEO. Started a couple of companies, sold a couple of companies, and most recently was running this venture called Threshold 360, which was kind of the entrepreneur's dream job, if an entrepreneur can have a dream job. I know that's a little bit oxymoronic. I wasn't technically the founder of Threshold, but I was brought in as the company's second CEO really early on, like 12 months into the venture. I was the CEO that brought the company to market and kind of found the initial business model. Listen, it was a lot of fun. By God's grace, we grew from about 5 people to 150 people in 2.5 years. Not all of those were full-time employees. In fact, the vast majority were not. But those people were making close to a full-time living with the business. And, so that business was growing really, really quickly. At the same time, my first traditionally published book was released a year into my tenure as CEO. So I had finished the manuscript for this book called Called to Create in, I think, September 2016. I started as CEO of Threshold the next month. And then a year later, Called to Create comes out and does really, really well. Hit a couple of the bestseller lists. And I wake up one morning, I'm like, okay, I have these 2 amazing gifts that God has given me. Threshold, which is growing really quickly. My career as an author, which I didn't even think of as a career. Like it was just kind of a book I had to write. But a couple of things led me to the place where I knew I had to put all of my eggs in one of those 2 baskets if I wanted to do my most exceptional work for the glory of God and the good of others. I knew I couldn't continue to do both. There were a number of factors that led to my decision to recruit a replacement for me as CEO. One, I thought the business could frankly use somebody with a different skill set. Like there's one skill set that I have of going from 0 to 1 in something. That's very different from somebody who's able to manage an organization past that true startup stage. Second, I was traveling away from my kids way too much. And third, I just looked around it. The message behind all my books today is that the work I was doing in this quote unquote secular tech startup, which is not secular, is just as sacred as the work I'm doing now as a Christian influencer. And I believe that with all my heart. But I thought that the role of writing was more unique. Like I looked around and I said, all right, There's probably 1,000 people, more than that, in this world who could run Threshold as well, if not better than me. But there were very few people, none that I knew of, who had the skills and vision for 50 books and Netflix series and podcasts helping Christians connect the gospel to their work. And I did have that, right? And so it wasn't a choice between better and best. It was a choice between how many people currently have their hand raised and are interested in doing this work. And I just saw writing as a more unique lane. So that is way too long of an answer to your question of how I made that call, but that's the answer.
Yeah, nice. So you're talking about the list of all the different content ideas that you had. Was that something that's just been percolating over the years and it culminated in you writing a book, but you had so much more ideas that you wanted to get out?
Yeah, and I probably give myself too much credit in retrospect. I had some ideas of what was next content-wise. I knew directionally that, yeah, there's audio content here, there's TV, but it wasn't a very concrete vision. I'm not sure that you can really have a well-formed vision for what's next when you're still focused on what's now. I think you need to know directionally what it is. I think you got to have some evidence and some capital in that life raft, but I just don't think it's possible to know the full path. And so all I had was, by God's grace, I had a deal from Random House for my second book, Master of One, which is basically the story I just told you, like how I came to this decision that I had to put all my eggs in one of these two baskets. You know, that plus what we already had in the bank was plenty to get us through at least 6 to 9 months. And so I was like, all right, yeah, I think that's enough. And I think I got enough of a vision for what's next to pull the trigger on this.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, you know, your second book, Master of One, it came out in January of 2020, which was just a few months after you started your podcast.
Yeah.
And so I'd love to know what the relationship was with, okay, you're writing this book and then you're going to start the podcast. How did those work together? What did that look like?
I started the podcast, which today is called the Mere Christians Podcast. Back then it was called the Cult of Mastery. So you can see some tie-in there we'll get to in a second. But I started this without ever having been a consistent consumer of podcasts. To this day, I consume virtually zero audio content. I've just never been a fan of the medium. I think it's a terribly, terribly inefficient medium for learning. And the tools continue to suck to that end to make it more efficient. But my audience was asking for it, like over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Right, number one. Number two, I saw how podcasting could be the silver bullet for networking and building my relationships with other authors. And so, yeah. And then number three, we had this book called Master of One that was coming out. I thought a podcast could be an interesting way to begin talking specifically about that topic of how do you pursue world-class excellence in a given vocational field in a distinctly Christ-honoring way, right? It was a means of warming up my list, frankly. So by God's grace, my email list was in pretty good shape, but the podcast was like, okay, let's start talking about this topic specifically. Yeah, that was kind of the connection there. And then, as you know, over time, we changed the name and refined the focus of the show, which is a whole other, separate journey. But yeah, that was the genesis of it.
Yeah. So I want to go back to something that you said, which is that you made a podcast, but you're not really one to consume podcasts and you prefer learning a completely different way.
Yep.
How is developing the show and starting the podcast for you? Did you find it to be a grind, or was it something that you felt like you knew what you were doing as you got into it?
Yeah, there's competing data, even in my own highlights of books that I've consumed throughout the years of, Walt Disney would tell you there's great value in being a total novice to a platform. I think he'd be like, oh, Jordan, that's why you've been successful, because you didn't know the medium. That's why he said he was so successful at Disneyland. It was one of the reasons, right? On the other hand, you have other people say, no, you got to learn all you can about the medium before you start it. I think, as with all things, what is it? Job 11:6 says that true wisdom has two sides. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle of those things. So while I was not and am not a consumer of audio, at the start of the show, I certainly consumed a lot of audio. And I went out and said, okay, who are the best interviewers on earth, right? And I remember I listened to Conan O'Brien, Tim Ferriss, I listened to a few others. I can't remember. I remember those. I think Tim might still be the greatest interviewer in the world. And so, yeah, I listened to those. I took a lot of notes. And then over time, to get better at my own craft, I don't listen to my own show, but I'll go back and spot check episodes, right? Not just for quality, but for me as an interviewer to take notes on myself on how to better master that craft. So it didn't feel overwhelming to me when I started to answer your question, because I think by God's grace, I'm naturally good at going from 0 to 1 in things. And in fact, I think I have a lot more energy when I'm going from 0 to 1 in new mediums. Like, I think that's where like magic really, really happens. Like when you're creating your first podcast, or when I created my first picture book. Right now, I'm creating my first TV show, right, for streaming platforms. And like, there is an indescribable energy and I think creativity that happens when you're creating in a new medium for the first time. That's hard, maybe impossible to replicate the second time you create something in that medium.
Yeah, for sure. So as you mentioned, you've had some big names on your podcast. You've had Tony Dungy, Carly Fiorina, Tim Keller, Candace Cameron Bure. How have you built relationships and networking, like you mentioned, over the years to be able to sit down with folks like that?
Oh man, this is like the number one question we get asked about podcasting. I should have tips more streamlined than this, but let me just kind of give them off the top of my head. Number one, just ask, like cold. like just ask, right? Like, you'd be shocked at the people you can get by just shooting an email through their website. Nate Bargatze's dad, Stephen Bargatze, magician. I'm interviewing him tomorrow. Stephen's a pretty big deal, right? And we just cold pitched him and he said yes. So that's number one. Number two, man, if you're looking for a big name, especially big name authors, if you time it right with when they're releasing a new book, you can get almost anybody. Authors say yes to shows that they should never say yes to, right? When they're releasing a book, because they're just in that mode. They're like, oh yeah, what's another interview in a day where I already have 3 scheduled? So my advice is, and people will debate the timeline, but I would say you want to be interviewing them, I don't know, 2 to 3 months, in that 3-month window prior to their book releasing. Now, their schedules get filled up really quickly, so that probably means you need to be reaching out 3 to 6 months ahead of their book schedule. So to this day, there are still really big name guests that we want that we haven't been able to get. I want George W. Bush. I want Condoleezza Rice. I want Denzel Washington. I want Jimmy Carter, right? And so we have a spreadsheet that tracks these people, these VIPs. And I think it's once a quarter, my assistant goes on Amazon, looks at any new upcoming books from these people and pings me like, hey, this book just went available for pre-order. It doesn't come out for 12 months, but you want me to reach out? And I'm like, yeah, reach out 6 months from now, right? So that's number two, like time. So number one, just reach out cold. Number two, time it with their release cycles. And then number three, you'd be shocked at what kind of introductions you can get if you can map a really good second degree connection to the person, right?
Yeah.
That's fairly easy to do, right? Like, for example, let's say you want Candace Cameron Bure. Go to Amazon, search Candace's name, and look at all the books that she did not author. And when you pull them open, more than likely she's endorsed those books, right? So look for her endorsement. And then whoever that author is, I don't know, Jordan Raynor, she's endorsed one of my books, or Emily P. Freeman. If you know Jordan Raynor or Emily P. Freeman or whatever, ping that person and ask for that introduction. And more often than not, you'll get it. And I'll give one more bonus. Sorry, Tim. One more bonus.
This is great. This is great.
Ask on air. Ask your guest who you should invite onto your podcast to have a similar conversation. I've done that since episode number 1 of the Mere Christians podcast. And I have used that way more than you would expect to get stuff. Both Tim Keller and N.T. Wright, their answer to my question of who do you want to hear talk about how the gospel shapes their work was Dr. Francis Collins, who's arguably the most significant scientist of the last 100 years. After both of them said that, I asked Tim, I was like, hey, can you introduce me to Dr. Collins? He's like, oh, here's his email. And the subject line was, Tim Keller and N.T. Wright said we should talk. Right? There's no way that email doesn't get open. Right? And so sure enough, like, we got Dr. Francis Collins. That was a huge get just by simply asking on the show, hey, who else should we have? And we've had a lot of other big guests through that.
Yeah, that's fantastic tips. I haven't thought about we've done the release schedule thing before. I mean,
Yeah.
working at Ramsey, we would get pitch books all the time. But the whole idea of getting people by going and seeing what forward they've written for other authors and stuff and getting that second degree is a great tip.
Oh, and by the way, tip number 5. Sorry, let's write out that.
Yeah.
Publicists are your best friends.
Mm-hmm.
Like, publicists can be annoying because they pitch a lot of people that are not relevant to your show, but don't let that annoy you, because I promise you there's coming a day very soon when you're going to want to go to that publicist and ask for a specific interview. Publicists are your friends. I take calls with publicists just to like help them out, like make introduction, whatever. Because I'm like, publicists feed our pipeline with the kind of guests that we want.
Yeah, that's some great tips for sure. So I want to know too, as you were getting into podcasting and you're writing books and creating other content, at what point did you realize, okay, podcasting is going to be one of the pillars of our content strategy?
I think I knew it anecdotally pretty fast, where I would get off of the stage at events and increasingly people knew me from the podcast instead of the books. There's still a lot of books. Like, oh man, I loved Redeeming Your Time. But a lot of it's like, oh man, I love the Mere Christians podcast. But the thing that really convinced me of the value of podcasting, because listen, podcasting is freaking expensive. Mostly in terms of time, not even money. It's not that much cash, but it's a lot of time, right? And I've, to be frank, I've questioned a lot. I'm like, man, is it really worth spending 2 days a month on this thing? Because that's how much time I spend on it. And what convinced me that it was after, I believe it was my book, Redeeming Your Time. And after the launch, we did an analysis of my email list, because anytime somebody clicks through an email to listen to the podcast, we tag that person as a podcast.
That's great.
Right?
Yeah.
And so we went back through and looked at the pre-order campaign and found that if you listened to the podcast, you were 487% more likely, to buy the book than the average subscriber.
Yeah.
That was crazy to me.
Yeah.
And so that's what convinced me, okay, this is a thing. I think it's also particularly important for me and other personalities who refuse to spend time on social media. Podcasting can be a way to show a part of your personality that would otherwise show up on social media, right? Like, for example, like I rant on Taylor Swift, fairly frequently, more frequently than my listeners would like, right? On the Mere Christians podcast, right? And so it's a way to make you more human and to build a deeper and more intimate connection with your reader or your listener. And so that's, in short, what convinced me that, okay, this is a thing. I got to do it, even though it's not my favorite thing in the world. Although I do increasingly like it. Like tomorrow I'm interviewing an astronaut. I'm like, how cool is that, right? But that's what convinced me to keep doing it.
Yeah. I mean, that whole element of people are going to spend more time with you. I mean, it's an hour-long podcast and you're producing it weekly. If people listen to every episode a year, they're spending 52 hours with you. Yeah. That's probably more time than they're spending with a book that you write, with other content that you create. And so it's a huge asset in that way to build trust with people just by merely giving them the opportunity to spend time with you. So that's huge.
That's right.
So how has podcasting given you some opportunities that you would have never imagined having if you hadn't started a podcast?
Oh, yeah. I mean, the number one thing that comes to mind is just my network has exploded. Because of the podcast. I credit the podcast for Mark Batterson being a fairly close friend today. Tim Keller, before he died. Candace Cameron Bure, I wouldn't call a friend, but I can email Candace and get a response. Artie Sequeira. There's no other way to build relationships with these people in a way that's valuable to them other than this, right? I shouldn't say that. There are very few other ways, right? And so, yeah, man, like that's opened up the door really practically for book endorsements. A lot of times, if there's a really big name on my show that really resonate with my audience, I'll invite them to spend additional time with my Mere Christians community that we sell on the back end of the podcast. And I mean, for my community to spend an hour with John Mark Comer or Sky Jitani or whatever is a big freaking deal when they can ask those people questions live. And I wouldn't have that but for the podcast. So it's driving book sales by way of endorsements and them sharing about the book with their followers. It's driving my direct-to-consumer products, especially my communities where I bring these people in live. But I'll even give you one more. It's actually driving course sales too. My flagship course is this course we call Vocation Bible School, right?
Yeah.
And it's Faith and Work 101. It's helping you discover God's epic and freeing plans for your work, probably for the first time, helping you see how your work matters beyond the Great Commission, beyond making disciples. And one of the things that we market pretty heavily in there is this bonus that we call guest lectures. It's 50 plus guest lectures on the topics that I explore in the course. All these guest lectures are clips, really tight clips of the Mere Christians podcast. But it allows us to say, hey, we've got guest lecture content from Tim Keller, from Dr. Francis Collins, from Tony Dungy, from John Mark Comer, from the COO of Wikipedia. That's crazy valuable, right? And it's super valuable for people purchasing the course because they don't have to listen to those whole episodes to get that content. It's just a 2-minute clip with Tim Keller going deep on forgiveness in the workplace, right? Or David Platt going deep on how your job matters beyond the Great Commission. So again, the podcast is driving that direct-to-consumer product because we found a way to repurpose the podcast content in a way that's valuable within that direct-to-consumer product.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And that actually answers the next question that I had down, which is how all of the different pieces that you create, the podcast, the devotionals, the books, the vocational Bible school course that you just talked about, and the community, how they all work together. And it sounds like basically they're just feeding off of each other. People are listening to the podcast, they're coming over to a course or buying a book, and they kind of all feed off each other. How has that been beneficial for you as you're doing this full time? This pays the bills. How has that synergy led to the sustainability of what you're doing?
I wish I could say definitively, oh, here's how I know. I think a lot of this business model you can figure out and put a finger on it, but a lot of it you can't, right? And a lot of it you can't track because it's cross medium, right? You could theoretically have somebody buy your book and never give you their email address and then find the podcast and then purchase the course and you would have no idea, right? So it's super tough. I will say this, and it's not directly answering your question, but since I don't have a good answer, I'll go here, try to add some value here. We are not intentional about growing the podcast at all.
Okay.
And people are surprised by that. But number one, I think it's really expensive in my experience to do that. I think targeting's tough, although it's getting better. But for me, man, the email list is the asset. Nothing else matters in this business model. If you subscribe to the 80-20 principle, right? The email list is the thing driving 80% plus of speaking engagements, of course sales, of community sales, of book sales, whatever it is, right? And so for us, we think about this in terms of how do we grow the email list as quickly as possible? And then once you're on the list, how do we get you to consume the podcast to turn you into a super fan, right? That's where it fits strategically for us.
Yeah. So what's been the best way, since that's the focus, right?
Yeah.
What's been the best way to get those email addresses and provide value that people are saying, hey, I'll exchange that for an email address? What's that look like for you?
What it's been historically, Lord willing, is not what it will be in the future. But historically, this has looked like, and we're always going to do this. We're never going to stop doing this. I'll explain what I meant about the future here in a second. But historically, it's been me creating free 5-star content, and that piece is critical. Your free content has to be better than your paid content, right? Free 5-star content on platforms that have millions and millions and millions of my target market. I write for Christian professionals, right? And so I decided early on that YouVersion was going to be that platform for me, right? So I started creating, to this day, I have 75-ish devotional plans on YouVersion's Bible app, right?
Yeah.
I think those concepts 5 stars. Actually, I don't think that. I know that because I got the data, right?
Yeah.
And so people consume those plans, and then at the end of the plan, there's a call to action to subscribe for more free 5-star free content from me. It's my weekly devotional called The Word Before Work. It's a weekly email that goes out every Monday morning. That's my primary touch point with my email list, right? So that playbook you can make work on YouTube, YouVersion, anywhere where there is organic traffic to content that lives forever. Not Instagram, not TikTok, not Facebook, right? A searchable directory of content, even just a blog, but 5-star free content linking to some lead magnet that also gives them additional value. That's worked really well to date. By God's grace, we got an email list of about 150,000 people. I will say YouVersion's really dried up for us. Even though the quality of our content has gone up, subscriptions have gone down because there's so many careers on the platform. So 3 years ago, I would tell any ministry, you need to be creating on YouVersion. Do not link to your paid product. Link to a free lead magnet and get those email addresses. I no longer give that advice because in my opinion, YouVersion, I love those guys. YouVersion's not done a great job of surfacing the very, very best, and this is not subjective, objectively best content in the app to their users. And the number of plans and number of plan providers has risen to such a scale that those of us with really high quality content are seeing massive drops in subscriptions. So for me, man, it depends on how big your goals are. My goals are enormous. My number one goal right now is to 10x the list in the next 18 months. And the blessing and curse of 10x thinking is there's pretty much only gonna be 1 or 2 strategies that can help you hit that goal. And so for me, it's meta, right? Like meta advertising has to be the play. It's the only thing that can get that type of scale. That's the nut my team and I are trying to crack right now in real time. Literally before we hopped on, I'm writing this lengthy onboarding document for the agency we just hired to crack this nut for us.
Gotcha. Yeah. Have you also considered the best way to get in front of other podcast listeners as part of that strategy? Because Meta paid social is a great play for a lot of businesses. That works really well. But with podcasting specifically, if you can get in front of other podcasters, I mean, that's weeding out 50% of the people that don't listen to podcasts.
That's right.
And so have you done anything there and how has that worked out?
Yeah, it's a great question. And by the way, I do think it's a killer strategy for building your list. My buddy Chandler Bolt at Self Publishing School has some really good resources. I can't remember what episode numbers it is about how to use podcasting to grow your list. Yes, we have not been intentional about using podcasting as a means of growing the list because all the time that I have spent on podcasts as a guest has been to promote a book, right? And so we've skipped the opt-in and just left it as, hey, go get the book right now. It's called The Synchronous Secular Work, right? Sure. Whatever it is. So I don't know that that's a right strategy. I'm excited. It's on our roadmap of things we're really excited about testing in the future. But again, one of the reasons why we haven't prioritized it is I'm incredibly skeptical that podcasting alone can get me 900,000 email addresses in a year, right? And
you have to be on some big shows,
That's a big shows. I've seen a lot of people build lists that way, and if you're listening, considering that, give it a shot. Absolutely, right?
Yeah.
Try it out.
Yeah, good to hear some different ways to go about it and ways you've done in the past and how you're pivoting for the future. That's really great advice for those of us that are thinking through that stuff as well right now. As you look back at the almost 5 years that you've been a podcast host, how has having a podcast helped you amplify your mission and grow your ministry of Jordan Raynor and Company?
How is it not? I mean, I think we talked about a lot of the ways it has. I'll add one more thing. When you're podcasting with great guests, and by the way, by great, I don't necessarily mean famous. I think one of the things I love most about the Mere Christians podcast is that we have such a good mix of names that you know and names that you never heard of. In a couple of weeks, I'm interviewing a construction worker named Devin. We've had janitors on, whatever.
Yeah.
But it really, just like having a cup of coffee with a friend as you're working on a next book would, doing a podcast allows you to experience breakthroughs in your thinking about what you're hoping to write in book or blog or whatever form in the future, right? Yeah. I remember very vividly, I was talking with my friend Mimi Chan, who runs a division of Amazon. And I had her on the podcast. We were talking about this, and I had this rant about the meaning of the word secular. I was like, that word literally means without God. But we believe that through the power of the Holy Spirit, God is with us wherever we go. And so the only thing you need to do to make your secular workplace sacred is walk through the front door or log on to Zoom. And as soon as I said it, Mimi was like, oh my gosh, like loved it. And as soon as I said it, I'm like, that's the introduction to this book that I've been working on for the mission. That's the first page, right? I always think about value per page potential, especially in the introduction. I'm like, that's the first paragraph of the book. And sure enough, that's what made its way into the sacredness of secular work. So yeah, it's driving all sorts of impact. It's reaching people that we wouldn't reach through nonfiction books. It's why I'm obsessed with other mediums, right? Only so many people are going to pick up a book called The Sacredness of Secular Work. So we have picture books in my portfolio. We have the Mere Christians podcast. I mentioned we're working on this TV project right now. Like, I'm obsessed with diversifying the mediums in order to reach various people with this message that their work matters for eternity beyond sharing the gospel.
That's great. I'd love to jump into, we've talked about some of the technical side of things, but I'd love to jump into that a little bit more in production. Back in 2022, you changed the name of the podcast from The Call of Mastery to Mere Christians. And so I'd love to hear why you decided to change that name and how has that impacted the show?
I've been thinking about this for a long time. When the show was called The Call to Mastery, there were really two parts of the show. The first half of the show, we would talk about how the faith of our guests, how the gospel of Jesus Christ shaped the work of our guests. And then the second half of the show was, okay, well, one of the ways the gospel shapes our work is that we have a deeper commitment to excellence and mastery in our craft. So let's talk about how you, as an Olympic athlete, as an entrepreneur, as an author, have mastered your particular craft. As much as I love that content, and personally, I consume so much, I'm constantly devouring biographies on believers and non-believers alike of how they mastered their craft. I'm reading a biography on Tiger Woods right now. I could not care less about golf, but I love world-class masters. But that wasn't central to the mission. It was part of the mission, right, of helping people connect the gospel to their work, but it was getting too prominent a placement, right? And I'm just a believer in, with any product, whether it's a book or a podcast or a devotional, should be about one thing, not two, not three, not five. And my show is about two things, right? So I was convicted of that. And number two, there was this guy who was the assistant attorney general for the state of Virginia. If you've seen the show Dopesick on Hulu, he was actually portrayed in this show. His name is Rick Mountcastle. He was responsible for helping to convict Purdue Pharma during the OxyContin crisis. This is a guy, world-class master of his craft. I found him. I tracked him down. Again, another cold pitch email that got a big name on our show. But we almost didn't get him. His reply was, hey, man, I would never describe myself as a master of my craft, which, by the way, is the mark of a true master. True masters never believe that they have achieved mastery. They believe they're on a lifelong pursuit. And so that email, he had his cell phone number in his email signature. I called him right away. I was like, Rick, if anyone's a master, you're a master. He's like, okay, I'll do it. I was like, but I'm changing the name of the podcast. And so Rick Mountcastle played a role, but mostly it was a focus issue. A third thing was, I'm a big believer in branding your audience, giving your audience a name if you can. It's really hard to do, right? But Pat Flynn talks about this and the power of this in his book, Superfans, which is exceptional. And Mere Christians was like so perfect, other than being a blatant steal of Lewis, is a descriptor of our audience. My audience are not pastors and religious professionals. They're mere Christians working at Ramsey Solutions, working as baristas and accountants and entrepreneurs. And that's who I want to write for. That's who I want a podcast for. So we're like, you know what? Let's do it. Let's call the podcast what our listener is. And now we're like really, really leaning into that brand. I haven't talked about this publicly yet, but my next book coming out May of 2025. It's called 5 Mere Christians. Basically, James Patterson-like biographies on the 5 people I want most on the podcast, but can't because they're dead. It's like kind of the pitch of the book, right?
Gotcha.
So we're like all in on the brand and doubling down on it.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, another thing that I feel like you've done really well is because I went back to listen to earlier episodes prior to that. And so you do a really good job of writing this pre-roll disclaimer of telling them what they should expect and why it's different, but why it's the same. How has that helped you keep those first 150 episodes under that previous name relevant to your audience?
I don't know, but hopefully it has, right? Like, I do think there's an interesting insight technically here, though, for anyone who's ever interested in changing the name of their podcast. So I'm a super fan of Simplecast. I love the platform. I just think they do a great job of audio hosting, and I love the tools. And they have a great feature. It's expensive, but I think it's worth it. And a lot of these podcasting platforms have it's dynamic ad insertion, right? Yep. Where you could take in one click across all your episodes, add the exact same audio file to the top, to the end, to the middle, whatever.
Yep.
And so that's how we did this. We had 150 episodes in the pipeline. I was like, I'm not creating a new podcast. We have hundreds and hundreds of reviews, right?
Yeah.
And so we upgraded our Simplecast account so that we could manually select those 150 episodes. And now there's a preamble on episodes 1 through 150. It says, hey, the episode you're about to listen to was released when this show was the Call to Mastery. This is basically the exact same show. You're just not going to hear professional development mastery stuff. Enjoy the episodes, like 60 seconds, right? Yep. And I don't know if it's worked, but listen, our numbers keep going up. Yeah. And we even saw after the rebrand, and we gave the rebrand some time, numbers continue to go up. So I think it's working, right?
Yeah.
But there's a lot of guesswork in the land of podcasting, unfortunately.
For sure. So I've heard you mention your production team on the podcast. And so I'd love to hear, what was the first part of the production process that you're like, I need to hire somebody to help me with this?
So I actually outsourced everything from day one.
Okay.
Which I don't typically do, right? Like, I'm a big believer in, doing it till it's painful and then outsourcing. But for this, it was so technical. I had no idea what I was doing. Man, this is kind of crazy to say. We have the exact same team. Same team that we started with 5 years ago.
That's great.
So I have 2 producers that help me select guests. And then after I'm done recording, one of those producers who is seminary trained, which is important to me to weed out bad theology, we just cut stuff. I'm like, nope, it's not God's word. Just cut it. No questions asked. So he goes through and does a substantive edit and makes calls on what to cut, what to keep to make the value per, it's not page in podcasting, but value per minute as high as possible.
Yeah, right.
And then he sends it out to a team of technical editors. We've hired an agency to do our technical editing, and then they package it up, and that's pretty much it.
That's great. Yeah. So another question about the production side of things is you have a book called Redeeming Your Time. So I'm guessing you've built some great time management habits around the podcast to continue to produce that month after month. And you'd mentioned, you do 2 days a month worth of production work. So what are some of those habits that have enabled you to produce a weekly podcast?
Yeah, I'm the biggest believer in mega batching. I talk about this in Redeeming Your Time. Mega batching is this idea where you batch similar tasks into a confined period on your calendar to minimize the mental startup cost that it takes to get into that zone, if you will, of that task, right? Instead of recording 1 episode a week for my podcast from the very beginning, I was like, no, I'm going to record a ton at a time. Actually, at the beginning, for maybe a year, I dedicated 2 weeks at a time to the podcast, and I recorded once a quarter. That was dumb. I will not do that again. Today, I batch 2 days. It's typically the first Monday and Tuesday of the month. Monday, I spend prepping. Takes about 4 hours to prep for 4 episodes. And then Tuesday, I spend 4 hours of that Tuesday recording, which basically takes my whole day, except for email and deep work block at the beginning of my day. So that's been a game changer. I really like prepping the day before. I used to prep weeks ahead of time, and I'd forget the questions, and it's just tough. I'm way more prepared to ask follow-up questions and to make the points I want to make after they give their answer, once I've done it right before. The other simple time management practice that's been essential here, I used to have a 15-minute break in between interviews. That was crazy. As soon as the episode's done, I record the intro and outro.
Okay.
And so I now have a 30-minute buffer, and I usually have loads of time, but I'm a big believer in budgeting ample amounts of time in your day in general, but especially when you're podcasting. Helps you make creative connections between the episodes, generate ideas for future work. It just makes you unhurried. I'll also say this as a last tip, and I go really deep on how to do this in Redeeming Your Time, but I never have notifications pinging me ever on the podcast or when I'm doing this as a guest or when I'm writing, whatever. And I cannot imagine producing 5-star content, whether it's a book or audio format, having any kind of distractions on your desktop or your mobile. Like, it blows my mind. I don't think people do it. I just don't think people can create 5-star content that way. I'm probably discarding that because it's been a habit for so long. But I dive deep into how to do that and not miss anything urgent in redeeming your time.
Yeah, that's a great thing to do. I feel like it's something I need to definitely grow into is like block the time on the calendar for those type of activities. I need to go check the email as opposed to seeing the notifications pop up on my phone. I'm like, oh, that's probably something I need to respond to. And then it's already in your head. And then it's too late.
Yep, that's right.
Whether you respond to it or not.
One of those messages, according to the University of London, is twice as harmful to your mental state as marijuana.
Wow. That's interesting. That's crazy. Man. Another thing that you do really well is the onboarding process for getting guests on your calendar. So like for this interview, your assistant sent me a Calendly link and it was a super smooth and great experience that, ended with landing on your media kit page. So people that are interviewing you about a specific book, that have all of the information there, have headshots, all of that stuff. Walk us through how you set that up for those that are listening that want a flawless experience for their guests that's frictionless like that.
Yeah, man, it's a great question. I'll try to remember how, but let me just take a second and say why. Like, we're talking with believers, right? Most experiences with Christian brands sucks. I mean, most experiences with brands, period, suck, but particularly Christian brands. And that's a shame because we are to do all things for the glory of God. And doing things with mediocrity does not glorify. It does not reveal the character of the God who created this gorgeous landscape that I'm looking at outside my window, right? I just think we ought to have a really, really deep commitment to this. And so the how, it's really just mapping out first in a Google Doc format or a note on your phone, whatever, just every single step of the process, every single touch point, all the way down to the text that you use in your custom Calendly link, right? And what it says. And then just mapping out and going through it yourself, right? Like go through it yourself. Like how do people get into your podcast and go through every single touch point and make every single touch point, even the most mundane, remarkable. But that starts with documenting every single touch point.
Sure.
I would just encourage people to spend some time in the details of the tools that they're using. So if it's Calendly for booking, like go into every single screen that Calendly allows you to customize to make sure that everything is perfect because people can feel excellence, right? They can feel it in their bones as they interact with your brand. And it makes such a difference when people show up on the show. So that wasn't super practical advice. And honestly, I don't even think we're like exceptional at this. I think we're really good. I don't know that we're exceptional, right? Man, I think it's so important that we strive to be exceptional in every single touch point. There's a sign that hangs in my office. It's a quote from Walt Disney. It says, "All horses jump, no chip paint." Makes no sense on the surface, right? But he was explaining to a buddy of his how much he hated the carousel at the park that he used to take his daughters to because half the horses didn't jump. There's chip paint all over the place. And when he's creating Disneyland, he's like, all horses jump, no chip paint, right? And man, believers should embody that in everything they do.
Yeah, that's a good word. That's a good word. What are you most excited about for the future of the Mere Christians podcast and your ministry as a whole?
Honestly, I'm most excited about this TV show we're working on, which I can't talk a lot about, but really excited about that. And I find that as I engage in new mediums, it renews my passion for the other mediums, i.e. the podcast or books, if I can draw a line between how those things are connected together.
Yeah.
The TV show we're working on is really an extension of the podcast and the book I mentioned before, this 5 Mere Christians book.
Yeah.
So it's all very synergistic. So man, that's what I'm pumped about right now. Learning a lot. It is roughly 1 billion times easier to make a podcast and publish a book than it is to make a TV show.
I bet. Yeah, there's so many moving pieces and so many hoops to jump through with that for sure. So let's jump into the high pass segment now where we ignore the lows and I ask you about some of your favorite things.
Yeah.
So first one is, what's been your favorite book that you've read this year?
Gosh, love this question. This is tough. I always try to think about this as like, what book have I been talking about the most?
Yeah, sure.
Up until a year and a half ago, I didn't read fiction like at all. And I crushed the Hunger Games this year and just had a blast. Man, it was super fun. So I love that. On Sabbath, I have a Sabbath only read. So yes, on Sabbath, I read a book about kids killing each other. Yes, that you heard that right. I also love any book about the craft of creating content. I read the Comedians in Cars Getting Coffee book by Jerry Seinfeld. It was extraordinary. Extraordinary. Like, it's rare that you hear the top 0.1% of people in a craft talk about their craft. It's even rarer to hear the top 0.1% interview the other 9 in the top 0.1% about the craft.
Yeah.
And that's what that book is. And I think any creator, whether they're authors or podcasters or whatever, have so much to learn from stand-up comedians. Like, I actually think it's one of the most interesting mediums to study. And so, man, I really love that book.
Yeah, I'll have to put that in the show notes. So if you want to go check it out, yeah, go click that link. What's your favorite hobby right now?
I don't have hobbies. I felt a lot of guilt about that for a lot of years. Then I realized that pretty much none of my heroes had hobbies. Fred Rogers didn't have a hobby. He swam every day. It was exercise. That wasn't a hobby. C.S. Lewis's hobby was drinking beer at 10 in the morning with Tolkien, right? Which, like, I guess, I love craft beer. I don't drink it at 10 in the morning, but like, yeah, I guess we could call that a hobby, right? Like, I don't have hobbies, and I'm totally comfortable in my own skin about that.
Yeah. Okay. What's one of your favorite stories from a listener about how Mere Christians has impacted their life?
I'm thinking of my now friend, Jake Reed. Nobody knows Jake Reed's name. Jake is an assistant manager at a Trader Joe's in Idaho, right? He's working a regular job, like probably most of our listeners, right? But I had Jake on the show, actually. I love bringing listeners onto the show. I love bringing longtime listeners, first-time callers on the show. He's just like, yeah, man, like, I've just been listening to this show forever as I've been doing this job. And it's just transformed the way that I see the people that I work with and see this as just as much ministry as my pastor. By God's grace, we have a lot of those types of stories. I don't know why that one came to mind first, but that's what came to mind.
That's great. Well, as we close, I'm going to pull a question out of your playbook, which is, who else do you feel like I should interview on this podcast?
Yeah, there you go. I love it. I love it. I love it. I mean, Carey Nieuwhof, I think, is thought really deeply.
I'd love to have him on.
I'd be happy to forward that introduction along. See what we're doing here? Look at building your guest pipeline. I think that here's who you should do. You should talk to my buddy John Houghton. John, about a year ago, took the CEO job at the Holy Post with Skye Jitani and Phil Vischer. And John and I have had a lot of conversations about how to turn that podcast into a true media business. And I mean, geez, they're consistently in the top 10 in the Christian category. Like, they're killing it. But it's one thing to be killing it in a podcast and another thing to be killing it in business, right? And like, I think they're going to crack that nut. I think they're really going to figure this out. John's a really smart guy. He knows nothing about media by his own admission, right? I shouldn't say he knows nothing. He's been in the job a year now, right? He knows a lot now. But when he started, he didn't know a ton. But they're figuring out and doing a great job of it.
Yeah. Yeah. That'd be great too. Well, thank you so much, Jordan, for taking the time to be on the podcast, share your journey with our audience today.
Absolutely. My pleasure, Tim.
That was one of my favorite conversations so far on this podcast. I mean, Jordan had so many great tips to share with us, and I hope you're writing those down. But if not, don't worry. I've added chapters to link to those parts of the conversation so you can jump back to them real quickly. You can listen to Mere Christians with the link in the show notes. Well, that's going to do it for this episode of Ministries That Podcast, produced by Sonomorphic. If you enjoyed today's episode, follow or subscribe to the podcast and share it with a friend. That's the best way to get the word out. So together, we can help more ministries grow and thrive through podcasting. Now come back in 2 weeks to hear my conversation with Angie Elkins. She's the manager of the Lifeway Podcast Network and host of Let It Shine with Angie Elkins. Angie and I are going to talk about what made her want to start a podcast back in 2017, her most successful strategies for growing a podcast audience, and her favorite podcast mic to recommend. And it happens to be under $100. Well, until next time, keep encouraging your audience as they follow Jesus.